Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Michael Conforti, the founder and director of the UCC Institute. And I want to welcome all of you to our August conference, which for the first time that we're doing, and probably most groups around the world, we're doing virtually because we can't travel. So what we've done is we put together, I think, is a phenomenal conference. We're looking at the presence of psyche in matter in the material world. Something we're also talking about is the further investigations of synchronous events. And what has been the tradition of the UCC Institute since our inception in 1989 is looking for people that have made a huge contribution. And look, I put this program together, and I had the great privilege of inviting people whose work I deeply admire, respect, and find has made an impact on the world and on the profession. And I remember one year giving the introduction in the CCLA, probably one of the first years I introduced the faculty. I said, there are many people around the world teaching, many people. There are millions of lecturers, some really good, some not so good, some really great. And there's a handful of people that are making a difference, that are saying things that most people never even thought about. Where you have that moment during a presentation, you say, my God, it would have never dawned on me to consider that. Well, hopefully in our lives, or in our life, we have found at least one person, if that maybe two or three, that has been in that role in our life. And Dr. Ulanov has been that for me. She was probably the greatest teacher I had at the Young Institute in New York when I was there. I began in 1979. And the classes were just awe-inspiring, profound, psychologically astute. But I think all of those were there, but the most important thing was she was able to get to the heart of an issue that we didn't even know there was an issue in it. From theological concerns to archetypal issues. And it was always like a Ulanov twist to the story that we would never consider. And you realize, my God, it's brilliant. And I've only had that experience in reading a handful of people. Reading Elie Wiesel, I've had that experience. Some of you know Robert Langs and Yoram Kaufman. I mean, the people that I think are really good. Obviously, Jung and von Franz. And Anne is part of that, I would say, one of the early group of pioneers. Obviously, a different generation from Jung and von Franz, but part of that genre of people that know this world of psyche is real. It's not a construct. It's not one of the constructivists. It's somebody who lives this work. The theological and the psychological create a confluence that's just a wonderful meal. So, look, I've said enough. I could go on for hours talking about her work. You all know, you all read her description in terms of the plethora of books she's written. She's one of the most prolific Jungian analysts in the world on subjects that have affected all of us, from poison ivy to Cinderella sister to the feminine to Christianity and feminine Christianity and Jung. And it's a wide-ranging subject matter, but it's all around the theme of what really touches and transcends a life and how it makes a life more meaningful. So with that, I couldn't be happier and more proud to introduce Dr. Anne Ulanov as our keynote speaker for this year's conference. Dr. Ulanov, welcome. Welcome to the Institute. Okay, you're ready.
Thank you, Michael. So generous of you. Thank you. I'd say just a little introduction before I begin. You all probably know about Jung's Red Book. My topic is going to be on his Red Book, and you'll remember that the Red Book is his account of lava-like fantasies overtaking him that changed the way he saw the psyche, the soul, and the world. He says of these images that they're the most important in his life, and he spent the rest of his career extrapolating from them, translating them into psychological concepts. It's also the case that he was at the height of his fame when these fantasies erupted in him. He was famous in Europe and in America and in England and other European countries. He later went to more foreign lands. He was happily married. He had 5 children. His practice was booming. He had a very close companion and collaborator with outlining his new psychology. But he said, I lost my soul. And the book is the story of finding his soul and what he learned from it. So my title is Blundering into the Work of Redemption. That's a quotation from Jung. So now I begin. It's very hard to talk about the Red Book. You touch it in one place, and it touches you like a tar baby in every other place, and the whole book comes up at once. The trickster Brer Rabbit, who was tricking the wolf, now tricks us. How to find words for the venture, the journey in the Red Book, without draining away its life. As well as draining the journey, it's going to stir up in you if you touch the Red Book. Something will happen to you on that same level from which it arose in Jung. Jung calls it your own mystery play. So one danger is we can get abstracted by our interpretations, or the other danger is we can get submerged by unconscious currents stirred up in us that take us right out to sea. So of course all Jung's critics want to say, this guy is mad, he's crazy. And that's the best protection against being initiated into our own task of linking what Jung calls the below to the above. He's living this experience. He's right in the midst of it. He takes a vow to take with utmost seriousness every wanderer he encounters. And he doesn't clean up the text. All his complexes show in their strife and their anguish. Nor does he sum up his venture with a clear conclusion, but he stops for the first time abruptly, saying, I've got to go back to the Middle Ages to deal with the barbarian in myself. Then some years later, he took up the book again and tried to finish it or add to it. And this time he stops mid-sentence, saying, I must go forward, quote, with the help of alchemy, unquote, to absorb the overpowering force of the original experiences. I'm going to focus on 3 aspects of one theme in the book, and there are many themes. I've chosen just one that I think is central. It threads right through the book. And also I will mention Jung's way of approaching this theme. And this is a quotation. One blunders into the work of redemption, which is neither beautiful nor pleasant. It's so difficult, it's so full of torment, that one should count oneself as sick, not as one of the healthy, who seeks to impart their abundance to others, unquote. Jung feels nauseated, he feels empty, he feels he's a beggar. He feels his path is 1,000 feet deep. Indeed, it's of a, quote, cosmic depth that takes him beyond what he knows to where, again, quote, the pliers hold me fast. They held me, those depths, and I had to drink the bitterest of all draughts. Redemption means being saved, claimed, made good, recovered, regenerated, reformed. Jung calls his regeneration, he was smelted anew, as if the metal of him was melted down and then put together in an entirely different form. And his mode of apprehending all this is, quote, blundering, unquote. So here's my first focus, the temptation of the good, Jung begins his redeeming work from this original angle. Quote, Christ totally overcomes the temptation of the devil, but not the temptation of God to good and reason. Christ thus succumbs to cursing, unquote. Now, the good is what we identify with as our highest value, our hero, which we must disidentify from, indeed kill, as Jung soon in the beginning of the book murders Siegfried with the help of a small brown man who's been noted as a self figure. Now, a little digression. Jung's concept of self as the centering archetype of the entire psyche, unconscious and conscious, in contrast to the ego as just the center of consciousness, that is not yet a formulated concept when he's writing the Red Book. In fact, the beginning of self is in the Red Book, and I will quote the beginning sections later. So here's the small brown figure without whom he would not have been able to kill the hero. He writes, the heroic in you is the fact that you are ruled by the thought that this or that is good. It's indispensable. It's obtained in headlong, striving work. Or this or that pleasure is the good. Or the good ruthlessly represses the bad. No, you sin then. You sin against incapacity. Later he will call incapacity the inferior function. You sin against incapacity, but incapacity exists. No one should deny it, find fault with it, or shout it down, unquote. This hero Jung also calls our ruling principle and says what his is: his intellect, his reason, logos, thinking, force, efficiency, masculine, the science of the day. God has become identified with only the good of our developed ruling principle, and that excludes in us and in our culture as well the bad, leaving it, quote, to the mercy of decay, unquote. Jung descends then to his personal hell and complains his is so boring and stupid compared to the fun and daring of everybody else's hell. There he must deal with the rubble of everything he just pushed off the table, as bad, as stupid, as sinful, that now leads him to develop that incapacity. From that encounter with it will emerge paradoxical intelligence in contrast to intellectual intelligence, knowledge of the heart, eros, feeling, feminine, and what he calls magic in contrast to the science of the day. Magic we need, quote, to receive or invoke the communication of the incomprehensible, unquote. Jung then hears an announcement made to him. Quote, you will believe you have sunk into meaninglessness, into eternal disorder, and you will be right. Nothing will deliver you from disorder and meaninglessness, since this is the other half of the world, unquote. He goes on, but for him who has seen the chaos, there is no more hiding, because he knows the bottom sways, unquote. I remember when I first read that, the bottom sways, I remembered a patient saying to me, she said, the bottom of my mind is sliding. It's sliding sideways, unquote. Now, Jung even hard work at writing the Red Book. The soul chides him. And she says this, do you still not know that you're not writing a book for your vanity, but that you're speaking with me, unquote. Jung takes 25 nights in the desert to awaken his soul, quote, to her own life until she could approach me as a freestanding being, separate from me, unquote. So he approaches redemption from a new perspective. He writes, just as Christ tormented the flesh through the Spirit, the God of this time will torment the Spirit through the flesh. God does not appear in the flesh, but in spirit. And what is done to this God, you do to the lowest in yourself, to your incapacity. Who should accept the lowest in you if you do not? Unquote. So radical acceptance of all parts of us reclaims what has been rotting in our own personal hell. But the transformation now happens in a different location. It happens inside us in what he calls, quote, the sight of the innermost, unquote, our psyche, our soul, not outside us in God's laws, teachings, or ideals of art, justice, or reason. He writes, the beginning is always the smallest. It begins in nothing. I see a little something that falls into the sea of nothingness, where the nothingness widens itself into unrestricted freedom, unquote. Jung emphasizes the inextricable connection of the personal and the collective dimensions of our lives. When we serve the good to the expulsion of the bad, it lands on our neighbors. In the name of good, we try to kill the bad and therefore destroy community. In personal relations, we discover, quote, the bloodthirsty tiger that our neighbor denies. And he says, you, conscious only of your goodness, offer your human hand to me in greeting, and suddenly I feel a smooth cord around my neck, which chokes me mercilessly, and a cruel hammer blow to a nail struck into my temple, unquote. On the collective level, Jung learns the work of redemption includes accepting that we too can imagine intending and willing atrocities. We hope not to do them. We cannot cling to the good as protection against that awareness. And I understand this to indicate our task is to hold in consciousness both our capacity to exert terrible attitudes and actions in tension with the good we love and serve. We consciously suffer this fierce tension, this fierce stretching to hold both ends. Neither enact nor repress the bad, and thus suffer the dissolution of our defined distinction of good and evil. We thereby personally contribute to communal harmony by knowing that we can harm each other. This radical knowing with the heart comes to Jung through modes of apprehension associated with the feminine, for that is what he neglected to the mercy of decay. Now, the second emphasis I am making is changing gender. Jung changes gender in the Red Book. He returns to his masculine identification, enlarged and made more fluid. His mode of experiencing is to be in every encounter, not removed into abstract classification, but besieged by madness, up close with harangues with his soul, singing incantations, mourning Isdubar's sufferings, excited to discover Isdubar's reality as a real fantasy, and Jung painfully strung up in his own identification with Christ's crucifixion. If a feminine mode of relating is to be in the midst, touched, immediate, Jung is visibly here, even if he's a lonely, ignorant wanderer. Only gradually in the book does he rescue ability simultaneously to be in the midst and to reflect, previewing an expanded capacity for both modes of apprehension, what have been called feminine and masculine modes at once. Jung becomes pregnant. His soul as womb gestates and gives birth to the new God. Later, he becomes pregnant again with another child that might be understood as his work, from which he must differentiate himself, quote, to let everything sprout. The son grows out of himself. The myth commences, the one that need only be lived, the one that sings itself, unquote. The son, his work, he contributes to collective life. And at the end of the book, Jung as a person returns to his garden. For while he's a woman gestating and birthing a child, he becomes himself a child to the God, a state he finds humiliating and shattering, he says, but a state that reaches a presuppositionless consciousness, full of, quote, divine astonishment, chosen over the chosen over the ashes of rationality, unquote. This child consciousness that is free of constricting prejudgments is not the withering deadness of childishness, but the entry path, quote, of what is to come, unquote. The God is a child, and Jung is a child serving this God. And he sees all of us as the conceiving womb of God. Jung's soul is feminine, and it is not maternal, and it's not any kind of motherly container. This is a very important point, especially with the fashion of contain, rightly so, it's important, in-depth psychology for the last 20 years or more. Jung complains to his soul of how hard this journey is, how tired and ignorant and wandering and woeful he feels. And the soul snaps at him, "I'm not your mother." She is an other standpoint within him, freestanding in her own real presence, in her own right, challenging his vanity, his ambitiousness, his self-absorption, his addiction to words. He disagrees with her often, and often he yields, but not all the time. She, part of primordial origins, he will later call the mothers of the deep, and the mother principle who comes back as the fructive creative principle. She is the birthplace in him of the new God. Jung sees a man must become a woman to be able to see the otherness of the soul and to avoid becoming enslaved to women. And here's the next point, is very prescient, decades beyond what is rightfully in fashion now. Just in a sentence, he says this extraordinary thing. We, all of us, must go beyond the gendered, but not as a hard rule. Rather, each person responding appropriately to her or his actual situation. hence making space for diversity of paths. Jung's identification with this feminine part of himself grows from seeing how badly he mangled it and from his efforts to redeem it. Salome first appears in the book as crazed, unsighted, murderous, bloodthirsty, and she grows into a sane, sighted, womanly presence who desires to give her love to Jung. Jung panics, he recoils, he says, no, no, you will stifle my freedom, you will impose the burden of your life on me. He insists everyone must carry his or her own life. He encouraged his wife, Emma Jung, and his close companion, Tony Wolff, each of them to find their unique paths. Yet in writing and living the Red Book experience, Jung's actual dependence was heavy on Emma Jung, his wife, who raised their 5 children, sustained a steady home, presided over a big house, a staff, did the finances, became an analyst, and helped inaugurate the Analytical Psychology Club, thereby allowing Jung freedom to create his new vision of psychology. For that, he depended absolutely on Tony Wolff, who did receive and interpreted his fantasies and collaborated in creating new ideas of psyche, for which he received no official credit or even a footnote. Jung said of his Red Book experiences, "You need another and probably a woman," and said of his soul, quote, "I found you again only through the soul of a woman," unquote. And Tony Wolff was his soul companion for a time, and how can that be credited in a book title or a footnote? She became an analyst and the presidential force in the Analytical Psychology Club's life. Jung, depending on these 2 women simultaneously, the 3 of them privately and in public, suffered and enjoyed the pairing, so very unconventional at the time, with both sadness and gain to each. Jung presented seminar material on his Liber Novus, another part of the title of the Red Book, depending on the members to receive and validate his psychological experiences. He depended on some women colleagues' responses to chunks of his manuscript, and he salutes the many women whose work and analysis helped him develop his analytical psychology, and particularly to gather into theoretical articulation a feminine capacity within a man capable of enkindling relationship between conscious and unconscious. A very trenchant encounter with the feminine is Jung's discovery of a beheaded body of a small girl left in the bushes. A shrouded figure stands by and says she is the soul of this child, and commands Jung to ingest a piece of her liver to atone for her violation and murder. Jung is outraged, repelled, says, absolutely not. But then he yields, because he recognizes that as a man, he partakes in the worst of human depravity, and thus he could have participated in the girl's desecration and killing. The shrouded figure now reveals herself as Jung's soul. Hence, his soul is feminine and is also the soul of this dead female child, and Jung atones for violation of both. He sees also, by ingesting the girl's flesh, he destroys his, quote, formation, unquote, by which I understand image, his formation of God. In other words, his God image. And he sees that to create a God image for any of us is the highest act of creative love we are capable of. And now, instead, he receives within his body hot coals of the living God, from whom there is no escape. This God is real and wants to dwell with Jung in his everyday life. This changes the image of God and places it in the body, in the self, and changes the relation of good and evil and the relation of self and other. So now I turn to my third emphasis, which includes many parts, and I'm going to go right away to good and evil. Jung's soul is also soul of this small violated girl, an image of his undeveloped feminine as part of his incapacity, the rubble that he swept off the table. And he learns a terrible thing, that going down to begin to try to develop his incapacity, what's inferior in him, he discovers, quote, evil stares at you coldly, unquote. We thus blunder into redeeming our image of distinction of good and evil. The God is not just now our highest ideals of good, nor does it dwell only outside us. The coals of the living God are placed inside, quote, in the innermost sight of psyche, in body, in soul, through which we have any picture of self, God, or others. If we put all our energy into the ideal good God outside us, our human self is drained of its aliveness. It's left mired in the bad that we try to expel. God is then only of the above and excludes the below. We must take that energy back into ourself and recognize psyche as the bridge in us to God transcending us, a God that includes below and above. And our former picture of their sharp division dissolves. He writes, the warmth of life contains good and evil inseparably and indistinguishably. That is the way of life, but not the goal, just the way of life and the crossing, beginning the recovery, unquote. So I turn to God image now. He focuses on the distinction between God and God image. Facing the temptation to the good, Jung sees we cannot exclude the bad, and that changes our pictures of God. If it's true that the soul is not a maternal container for us, but rather the other standpoint in us, for, quote, the God is always where you are not, unquote. For Jung, that other location challenges his ambitious vanity, his undeveloped feminine modality, which for him is related to feeling. The point is, Godhead is also the other within us. In the form of God images, our soul through our psyche creates, not some idealized distant deity unconnected to our all too human selves. We do not create nor find God, but deal only with our images of God, who also exists external to them. And here's his new image. The new image of God manifests as, quote, the supreme meaning, the bridge to the God that's yet to come. It's not the coming God himself, but his image which appears in the supreme meaning. God is an image, and those who worship him must worship him in the images of the supreme meaning, unquote. This meaning includes images of the below, which he itemizes: nonsense, absurdity, ugliness, ambiguity, as well as the beautiful, the true, and the good. We cannot put into God just the good and leave out the bad, lest we drain away our aliveness and pile all the bad on our neighbor's lawn. Jung complains, God wants to sit at table with me, work with me, be ever present. The divine appears to me as irrational craziness, stealing into reasonable, meaningful human activity. Unquote. This is the real, the living God. Jung's ingesting of the murdered girl's liver, which is surely an image of the below, destroys his image of God as idealized good, but leads to putting the glowing coals into Jung's body self. He can't escape now, and he will have to face them every day in the humdrum of his life. But, and a big but, Jung sees he cannot by himself destroy his formation, that is, his God image, of the highest God, the highest act of loving we can do. He can't do that by himself. Clinically, we see God images landing on whatever we call the goods. Might be money, might be political power, substances that call to us in drugs or drink or certain kinds of food. What we see as our highest ideals of knowledge, art, science, love, whatever in each of us acts as the central reference point around which everything else in the personality revolves. It could be our inferiority complex. It could be our love for our child. It's there if we look for it. I understand this God image as foundational, and its destruction would make us feel we were losing our mind, becoming totally disoriented, that madness would overtake us, like my patient who said, the bottom of my mind is sliding, it's sliding sideways. We cannot will to destroy our God image of the highest good, even though it now includes the bad. We can't do that by ourselves because it would make us feel we had torn up the ground on which we stand. We can only have that happen in shocking dependence on evil to do it for us and with us. Jung says you can't dissolve good with good. You can only dissolve good with evil. That dissolution leaves us with what we are to do then in the face of evil. And the shocking notice given that our personal problem with the bad opens to the human problem of how destructiveness finds a place in living. And Jung reaches an amazing response. It's really amazing. He says, good and evil unite only in growth from below to above. When growth stops, good and evil fall apart again into violent rivalry. That's his solution. That's what he discovered. We too have to discover how good and evil go together for us and don't. Now, we may want to piggyback on Jung's view. That's not impossible, but you can't just slap on Jung's view. You've got to make it your own. It's got to go through your own gut and your own heart knowledge. We must also find what we believe the place of destructiveness in livingness is. And this affects the inextricable, the unavoidable connection between individual and collective life. Working on our personal individual problem with what to do with the bad turns out to be our contribution to the impersonal collective problem with evil. No matter how tiny our work on the bad, it is our contribution to the huge human problem to find a place for annihilation in aliveness. We blunder to redeem, however faultily, the interpenetration of our individual and collective tasks of facing temptations of the good and of the evil. So now we come to God and the self. The Red Book opens and closes with direct references to God and the relation of God and self. In the beginning of the book, Christ is the one in the scripture is describing, and here are the quotations in the beginning of the book. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows. Unto us a child is born, called Wonderful Counselor, the Word made flesh. And at the book's end in the garden, Christ is a shade who brings, quote, the beauty of suffering, which I understand as the possibility that suffering, bad as it is, because related to evil, may include creative response. Searching for his lost soul, Jung blundered into God images, now other God images, very different from the God of the spirit of the times, and different from God as the supreme meaning. But these images were also real, which he knew because, quote, of the unshakableness of experiencing them, unquote. Hap, H-A-P, designates, quote, God's other pole, unquote. Hap is of the night, the flesh and blood spirit, of bodily juices, sperm, entrails, joints, eyes, ears, feet, sputum, excrement. Jung also fights with his soul when she steals the treasure of human love and his human love to hightail it off to heaven for her own salvation there. Jung yells, no, give it back, give it back. That's mine. Human love is mine, that's mine, and it belongs to humanity. It's humanity's lifeblood, and you should work for the good of humanity here. And surprisingly, the soul yields and gives back the treasure of human love. And so differentiation initiates between the need of the dead and the living, between the precious ego life here and life in the beyond there. Now, Philemon, who is the major self figure in the book, and now I'll come to where you hear how self begins to develop as a concept. He speaks to the dead, and he stands with Jung when all the dead come crowding back from Jerusalem. They were distressed. They couldn't lie down and be dead because they had questions. Something didn't get solved in their life. And they come back saying, we didn't get any answers in Jerusalem, so we're crowding into you. You give us answers. And Philemon, as the self figure, answers for Jung and to Jung. He talks about Abraxas as another God image, as creative force, formless and forming, the stream of life, creative drive, form and formation, and the sucking gorge of emptiness. Life and death in the same word and act, Abraxas is terrible, unquote. Philemon counsels we're to live our life against the force of Abraxas, for our individuation process counters Abraxas' blasting power. The dead crowd in because of their unlived life. They learn they did not individuate, but childishly cast all their burden of redemption onto Christ, let Christ do it for them. Christ commanding them to love each other, which they disobeyed and killed each other instead. Further, they denied the animal in themselves. They failed to atone, here's a lovely phrase, for, quote, the ox with the velvet eyes, unquote, or a very prescient phrase having to do with oil. They failed to do penance for, quote, the sacred ore that they dug up from the belly of the earth, unquote. In contrast, Philemon tells Jung, we must not naively put ourself so small into the bigness of God. Quote, since God sweeps away the self into the boundless, into dissolution, unquote. And Jung knew that fear. He was afraid at first that he was dissolving into a psychosis until he had the realization that what he was finding in himself turned out to be structures of psyche that belong to everybody. But he still says, quote, a living God afflicts our reason like a sickness with reeling chaos. How many will the God break? Unquote. Now, Jung, by sheer brute strength, in my opinion, survives the influx of God with a dawning, uneasy insight that, quote, the small, narrow, and banal is not nonsense, but one of the essences of the Godhead, unquote, that lives with us every day in the ordinary ego life in the world. So we must establish ourselves, we must wrestle ourselves free from God, pull it to our side from God, free the self from God, so we can live, unquote. Yet later, excuse me, somebody's diddling with the water. Diana, enough. Thank you. Philemon says he changes his mind, and he says we should live in the God, not the God live in us. Jung perceives, quote, not the self is God, although we reach God through the self. The God is behind the self, above the self itself when he appears, our heaviest wound, unquote. So then, if you have a sense of self, a self that you feel the shape of, you get to decide yay or nay. You can give it to God or not. And Jung writes, I believe we have the choice. I prefer the living wonders of the God, since I want to live. My life wants itself whole, unquote. Now, Jung, who wrestles to redeem his undeveloped feeling into living, he fills up with ardor, but not toward an individual person. That did not happen. What did happen was ardor for love itself, a devotion to love itself, not to fame and ambition, but living his own path, tending his garden humbly, which he ends up in the book and ends up in his life, living in simplicity in Bollingen. From his experience of giving birth, Jung reaches, quote, voluntary devotion. He sheds the mix-up, what he calls commingling, the mix-up of his ambition for personal fame with love. And thus he redeems his feeling function. It's painful, very painful. But he said, I had to decide for what is required of me. I accepted all the joy and every torment of my nature and remained true to my love, to suffer what comes to everyone in their own way, and I stood alone and afraid. And one proof of his endless devotion is for 16 years after the fantasies finished, and as and after he wrote them out in different forms, he spent 16 years every night after supper painting the images in the Red Book, which are, I understand them as entry points whenever he wants to enter back into encounter with this one or that one. The paintings are like gates to go through. Now he says this to all of us, and very directly, he uses the word our or you. Living our life to the full includes all your unlived life. Live what you've never yet lived. The life I could still live, I should live. The thoughts I could still think, I should think. That way leads to community and doesn't sap community by imitating our neighbor's way and neglecting our own, nor foisting onto other people who we think they ought to be instead of greeting who they are. He says, quote, each one of you seek out your own way. The way leads to mutual love and community, unquote. Quote again, if we fulfill the need of the self, through this we become aware of the needs of the communal and can fulfill them. But if you give up yourself, you live it in others, and thereby you become selfish to others. You infect them. To live yourself means to become your own task, a long suffering, since you must become your own creator. Now, Jung's astonished that his way turns out he has to become Christ, identify with Christ, not just follow him, to engage the temptation of the good, not just of evil, as did Christ, to suffer the torture of the spirit by the flesh, not just the torture of the flesh by the spirit, as did Christ. He saw he had to suffer his own mystery play. And he says of yours, you have your own, utterly poor and miserable, unknowingly humiliated. Go on through your gate. Jung does not identify himself with God. Jung remains himself. He writes, you do not become God. God becomes human as a child. I become Christ in the mysterium. I was made into Christ, and yet I'm completely myself, so I still doubt. So living our unique way demands accepting death into life, sacrificing striving, letting go of your ruling principle, and just one mode of being. To become what you are, an endlessly slow growth, from which will emerge knowledge from the heart, which is in no book, not in any teacher, but grows out of you like the green seed from the dark earth, drawing the darkness of death from the beyond into every day, empties the beyond because we live everything we can here. If I accept death, my tree grows. Limitation enables you to fulfill your being. Therefore, all the demands of the dead that crowded in disappeared because they got satisfied. I think also the dead represent the wisdom of the ages, that if we can accept the limits of finitude, we can draw upon the sages of the past for life to be lived today. Uniting with the serpent quells the devil's influence, because the devil invades through the serpent in you when you assign it to the devil instead of facing it belongs to yourself. He writes, I took part of the humiliation and subjugation upon myself. I gained stability, and that could withstand the fluctuations of the personal. Therefore, The immortal in me was saved. Then you learn from Philemon about your own God image. If you're engaged in the individuation process, which happens whether we know it or not, but happens more if we do participate in it, out of this arises, this is a quotation, a divine child, a reborn God. One, an individual, but in all individuals, born in many individuals, though they may not know it. It's the same everywhere. By living our life to the full, we will find our own particular image of the divine child born from our souls, and that is what will throw a bridge across death. Philemon says, this image that is yours of God, or if God is a difficult word, then think of it as your ultimate value or what you love best. That image, Philemon says, that's one God, that's your God. That's God as the kind, the loving, the leading, the healing. To that God you should pray. You are one with that God. That God is near you, nearer than your own soul, unquote. I understand this to mean the more devoted we are to this healing God image, this very personal God image, the more we participate in the wholeness of the whole. And then finally, at the end of the book, Philemon describes, quote, the celestial mother, the final intimation of the feminine in the book. It's a spirituality that conceives and embraces woman-like. Jung may come under her aegis when he completes his separation from the mix-up, the commingling that arises through his unlived love, where he still bonds with men and things. In other words, Jung's still in the process of that. He submits to it, the shredding of all those motives that compete with his voluntary devotion. He writes, I remain true to love. I willingly accept all the pain and suffering. Only thus do I arrive at my truest and innermost self, unquote. So I think, dear colleagues, by way of our blundering, to quote Jung, the time has arrived where each of us must do her or his own work of redemption, unquote. Thank you.
What a gift. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you.
I mean, this is a paper I think one could read about 20 times to see all the levels you're presenting here. It's a great piece of work. Can I ask what's the main thing that motivated this paper? I don't mean about personal things for you, but what issue really motivated this? What life issue, the collective life of all of us?
Blundering.
Blunder. I think we can relate.
But it's okay. I so admire the mess he leaves, the complexes. They're such a mess. And it's so encouraging to me that it cures me of any idea that I can get mine all spiffed up and polished and be done with them. No.
Well, again, thank you. Thank you so much for this. And we
Most
will
welcome. You're most welcome. Do I press leave now and disappear?
It's an ejector seat. It jettisons you through the ceiling. But
No.
again, it's always a joy working with you, and your contribution to the CC Institute they'll be with us forever. So thank you, Ann. Thanks again.
Thank you.